Gospel of John, chapter 6, and I'm going to be reading the first 14 verses, and I'll be reading from the New American Standard Version of the Bible, and you please follow along with whatever translation of God's Word that you have with you today. The Gospel of John, chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. John says, "After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd followed him, because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. And then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples, and the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Therefore Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?' Verse 6 says, this he was saying to test Philip, for he himself knew already what he was intending to do. And Philip answered him and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. And then one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people?' And Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in that place, and so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated, likewise also of the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, so that nothing will be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. And therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, 'This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world.'" I want you to look back at verse 2 this morning. Would you do that? Look back at verse 2. Verse 2 says, a crowd was following Jesus because of the miracles he had performed. Let me tell you, that may well be the single most obvious statement in the entire New Testament. If you're wondering if Captain Obvious was alive and well during biblical times, apparently the answer is yes. Of course there was a crowd following Jesus. Miracles were a common part of his ministry. He performed miracles often because he loved people and he had compassion on people and he saw their needs, and it was his desire to help and to heal and to change because he was their creator. They were his creation. Of course he did miracles, and so of course people followed. People saw those miracles. They wanted to see more of what would happen around Jesus. They wanted to know more about him. And we are not too far removed from them. We still enjoy reading the miracle stories because they show us Jesus at work one-on-one, which, by the way, is how we want him to keep working on us. Yes? One-on-one, isn't that what we pray often that Jesus would do? Lord, help me get through this situation. Lord, help me deal with that situation. Lord, give me wisdom. Lord, if you could change something. I mean, we enjoy the miracle stories because we still want to have some minor miracles in our lives too, yes? Amen. Well, 3 of you do. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I find in my life I need some minor miracles from time to time. So we read the miracle stories. Now, some of the miracle stories of Jesus are only recorded once. We got 4 Gospels. Some of them are only recorded once, but isn't it interesting that even the ones that are just recorded one time, we still know and we still love. Good example, the very first miracle of Jesus turning the water into wine, which is I think, one of the most wonderful miracles in all of the New Testament. Because how many times have we said, Lord, could you turn this mess into something acceptable? Could you change what's happening around me right now? That's a great miracle. It's only recorded once in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. It doesn't get a lot of writing, it doesn't get a lot of airplay, but all of a sudden, if you think about it, we really know it already, don't we? We know it anyway, even though it only gets recorded that one time in the 4 Gospels. On the other hand, some of the other miracles of Jesus are recorded in as many as 3 of the Gospels. We have 4 Gospels, and some of the really big miracles show up once, twice, even 3 times in the Gospels. And those tend to be the miracle stories that we really like to read, and we really like to talk about, and we really like to analyze. Some of the ones that happen over and over in the Gospels that really got the attention of the writers. For instance, Jesus healing the paralyzed man who was let down through the roof by his 4 friends. The bed attached to ropes, the roof broken up. You remember that story? This is where you shake your head, yes, okay? Yeah, y'all know that story, yes? I love that story. I like reading that story because it tells me that Jesus will deal with my situation even if I just show up and kind of let it down right in front of him. You ever had one, we talk about your boss having a come to Jesus meeting with you? Sometimes we go to Jesus and say, we need to have a come to Jesus meeting. I need to lay this mess right out in front of you. I love that story because it tells me that Jesus is ready to help us and work with us even when a situation just gets dropped right in his lap. Another one is the story of Jesus calming the sea during that storm on the Sea of Galilee. I like that story because it shows the power of Jesus. If you read that story literally, what Jesus said to the storm and the waves and the wind, Jesus just looked at that and said, hush, be still. Or as I've said to y'all before, the immortal words of all the great Southerners in our lives, "Get on out of here." It's the rough translation. Another one that's in that group that shows up in the Gospels multiple times is Jesus healing the woman who had the issue of blood. I like that story because it shows us the tenderness of Jesus. After she was healed, she was afraid. She thought she was going to be in big trouble. And so she comes and she falls down at the feet of Jesus. And what does Jesus say to her? Daughter, daughter, be of good cheer, be of good comfort. Your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. I don't know about you, but I like it when I'm worried that maybe I've done something wrong, and Jesus says, we're going to make this right, and it's all good. One more that shows up in that list of stories that are told often in the 4 Gospels is, oddly enough, is the story of Jesus sending the demons that were in the demon-possessed man who was on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the one that was running wild in the graveyard. People had tried to chain him up. People had tried to clothe him, and he was just kind of a wild man. And Jesus brought those demons out of him and sent those demons into, do you remember the story? Where did he send them? Into a herd of pigs. That's right. And they went running down the hill and kind of went crazy. You know why I like that story? Because we like any story that talks about bacon. That's why I like that story. Who doesn't like bacon? Right? I really like that story because that story shows us that not even the demons can stand against the Savior. He really is Lord. And one day, the Bible says, about. Were you aware of that? The very last verse of John's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 25, look at it later, says, "And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written." As Grandma said, I don't know about you, but as Grandma said, I'd give a shiny nickel to know what some of those stories are. And one day we'll know those. But we don't know them right now. There are things that Jesus did that we don't even know about. But there is one story out of all of those miracle stories that we are supposed to know about, and it's the one that we just read. In case you didn't know it, let me tell you this morning that the story that we just read, we call it the feeding of the 5,000, is the signature miracle of Jesus in his ministry. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle story that is included in all 4 Gospels. No other miracle story is in all 4. So this is the signature miracle of Jesus. It's in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and it's here in John 6. This story made an impression on all 4 gospel writers. So regardless of their different ideas about how to write the gospel story of Jesus, their different approaches, you know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke kind of took the same idea. John kind of went off on a completely different track. But regardless of their different approaches, each one of them included this story. So it's the signature miracle of Jesus. So that raises the question for us, why is this story so important? I think this story is important because it tells us about God's provision for us. Provision that we ought to recognize, provision that we ought to trust, provision that we ought to depend on, but provision that too often we are so busy trying to do things ourselves that we don't take account of this story. During Super Bowl 37, FedEx ran a commercial that spoofed the Tom Hanks movie Castaway. Y'all remember that story, that movie? Yes, you remember the story. Tom Hanks played a FedEx worker whose airplane went down and he was stranded on a deserted island. No Gilligan, no skipper, no Mr. and Mrs. Howell, just Tom Hanks. And you remember the one other character that was with him? Yeah, a volleyball, right. And so in this commercial that they ran during the Super Bowl, this actor who looks like a bearded Tom Hanks goes up to the door of a suburban home, knocks on the door, a lady comes to the door, and he explains to her that he survived 5 years on this deserted island, and he protected her package, and now he is there in person to deliver the package to her. And in the commercial, she's completely unimpressed. She just looks at him and says, "Thank you, keep up the good work. I'm sure the company's proud of you." And she kind of tucks the package under her arm, and she turns to go back in her house. And he says, ma'am, wait a minute. He says, if I could ask you, what's in the box? I've had it with me for 5 years. What's in the box? And she says, oh, I remember this package, nothing really. And she opens it up and she starts pulling things out of the package. She says, a satellite telephone, a global positioning device, a fishing rod, a compass, a water purifier. Oh, and then at the end she pulls out, oh, and some seeds. He had what he needed all the time, but he never opened the box. So like the contents of that package, this story reminds us that God always has what we need. And it's not just that God provides, it's that God provides in contrast to the hopelessness of the situation. Or at least how you and I perceive the hopelessness of the situation. Look at verse 5. Verse 5, it says, Jesus saw the crowd coming. And so he says to Philip, Philip, look at that. How in the world are we going to feed all those people? Now verse 6 lets us in on a little secret. It says that Jesus already knew how they were going to feed all those people. But he wanted to test Philip. Philip, throughout the gospel stories, was one of those disciples who was never quite sure about who Jesus was. Philip was one of the slow ones. Even in chapter 14 of the Gospel of John, as Jesus is speaking to the disciples near the end of his life, Philip is the one who finally just kind of throws up his hands and says, well, Lord, just show us the Father, and that'll be good for us. And Jesus looks at him and says, how long have I been with you? That you still don't know who I am? You still don't recognize me? You don't know that you've seen the Father? So Jesus wants to prepare Philip to learn from what is about to happen. Verse 6 tells us he knows what he's going to do, but he wants Philip to see it, to really see it, and to get it. And so he's asked the question, and in verse 7, Philip responds as Jesus knew he would respond. Philip was going to get out his calculator. Philip was going to go all logical on him. Philip was just going to look at what was humanly possible. And so Philip responds in verse 7, even 200 denarii worth. That's the Greek term for the coin that you and I would call a penny. And remember, in biblical times, a denarius or a penny was essentially a day's wage for a normal employed person. And so Philip says, not even 200 denarii would feed all that bunch. In other words, what Philip says is, I've done some calculations, and I'm telling you that half a year's wages wouldn't get it. It's out of our reach. It's not possible. Translation, Philip tells Jesus, there's no way out of this situation. I don't know any person who could provide what we need. Well, then in verse 8, another disciple tries his hand at the problem. Here comes Andrew. Andrew's kind of something of a fixer. Are any of y'all fixers? Or do any of you jump up and try to fix everything that's wrong? I know some folks who are fixers. Some of y'all are. Well, Andrew's a fixer. And he thinks Philip is just going about this all wrong. And so in his mind, he's thinking, Philip, we don't have to buy food for this crowd. Have you ever seen a bunch of Baptists gathered together? There is a casserole dish under every arm. I'm telling you, we don't have to buy food. We just have to reorganize what they have. I'm telling you, there's a boatload of food in this crowd. We just got to go find it. And so Andrew goes off and says, now I'm going to go through the crowd. Y'all let me handle this. I can fix this mess. Look, there's so many lunches out there. We'll share. We'll get everybody together. It'll be fine. And so Philip goes through the crowd. 5,000 people. And you know the story. Out of 5,000 people, one guy got lunch, 2 smoked kippers, and 5 pieces of flatbread. 5,000 people. And you know there is no way out of this situation. I don't know of anyone who can provide. Now, look what happens in verse 10. So, Philip has said, can't be done. We don't have any kind of money to buy what needs to be bought. Andrew has looked and said that they should have had, but they don't have, and so there's nothing that we can do about this. The answer of Jesus is in verse 10. He says, have the crowd sit down and prepare for the meeting. Jesus, unlike Andrew and Philip, is in touch with his Father, and he knows about God's provision, and that allows him to approach life with confidence instead of hopelessness. And then look what he does at verse 11. Look at verse 11. And y'all, you should have seen this one coming. You should have known. You should have guessed this one as soon as I read the passage. Look what verse 11 says. Verse 11 says, then Jesus took the loaves, and what did he do? He gave thanks. And you know what's interesting about that? I told you earlier, this story is in all four Gospels. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in their telling of this story, in each case say that Jesus took the loaves and he blessed them. The Greek word is eulogeto, from which we draw our English word eulogy. In other words, he praised God for the bread they had. But John uses a different word. John writes that he took the loaves, and then John says, and specifically, he gave thanks. And so the Greek word is different there. The Greek word here is Eucharistio, which literally means to give thanks. Now, there's not a lot of difference there, but what we're being told is that John, as he writes this gospel, John remembers. John doesn't want us to miss it. John wants us to get it. I'm telling you, John says, I remember that day. I saw him sit the crowd down. We didn't have anything. There was no way we were going to get anything. We were out in the middle of nowhere. We didn't even have a decent table to sit at. We didn't have a decent tent to get under. We didn't have nothing. But I remember. You could see it on his face. He took the bread and he gave thanks for it. There was a distinct attitude of thanksgiving in the prayer and in the life of Jesus. And what's very interesting is that from that word, Eucharistio, we draw one of our English words for the Lord's Supper. Not so much in the Baptist tradition, but in other traditions, the Lord's Supper is called, you know it, the Eucharist. And that word for the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, literally means to give thanks. Philip said, there's no way. Andrew said, I thought there was a way, but it turns out there's no way. Jesus said, be thankful and come have a seat at the Father's table. Even if that table is out in the middle of nowhere and the only table we have is the blades of grass. What we are supposed to learn from this story is that thanksgiving was prominent in the life of Jesus, and it ought to be more prominent in us, regardless of situation. There's a great old story about Alexander White, who was an old preacher of the Church of Scotland. He was famous for his pulpit prayers. He was known for always praying with thanksgiving. There was one particular stormy Sunday morning, and the weather was awful, and one of his church members in an old record is cited as saying, "The preacher will have nothing to thank God for on a wretched morning like this." White went to the pulpit and began his prayer, and he said, "We thank thee, O God, that it is not always like this." This morning I want to invite you to come to the Lord's table and to be reminded that God is able to supply our needs. He knows us, He cares about us, and He bears us through even the hardest of times. So I invite you to come to His table, which is a table of thanksgiving. It is a Eucharist. So come that way when you come to the table. The Apostle Paul told us very clearly in his letter to the Corinthians that when we come to the Lord's table, yes, we should come with thankful hearts, but we should also come with pure hearts. And so Paul said every time we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we ought to examine ourselves. And we're going to do that this morning. Brother Steve is going to come and lead us in chorus. This is our time of invitation. I invite you to spend this time preparing for the Lord's Supper, knowing that this is something very special in which we remember the shed blood and the broken body of our Lord for us, and that makes it very, very special. And we ought to prepare our hearts so that if there's any unconfessed sin in our lives, if there are any acts of omission or commission in our lives that ought to be dealt with, we do that before we come to the Lord's table. So only when our hearts are pure can we really give Him the thanks of our heart as we should. So Brother Steve, come and lead us. This is our time of invitation. We're going to stand and pray.